I first started reporting on the death penalty back in 2020 when I made a short documentary for Vice News about the case of Julius Jones out of Oklahoma. He was sat on death row and many believed he may be innocent. Since then, I've made countless videos and written tons of articles about the topic. Today, I'm going to be giving you an overview of some of the arguments people who wish to abolish the death penalty make. But first, you might be asking yourself why this British girl from England is talking to you about the death penalty in America. The answer is actually pretty simple, and it dates all the way back to the early 2000s when little Gabby was watching a documentary called 14 Days in May with her father. This harrowing documentary changed the course of my life. I was definitely too young to be watching it. It's one of the most heartbreaking documentaries I've ever seen. It originally aired in 1987 on the BBC, so this must have been a rerun. If you've not seen the documentary, I highly recommend that you go and watch it. It follows the final days of Edward Earl Johnson's life before the state of Mississippi executed him. He was convicted of murder and rape, but maintained his innocence and said that the police had coerced him into a false admission of guilt.
All I asked him, what is it? I ain't signing that. I don't know what this is. He said, don't worry about what it is, don't read it, just sign it. So I signed it.
Why?
Well, basically, because he told me to sign it, and I was scared. I don't know, but they got me by myself. Nobody knows who I'm at,
He was executed by Mississippi on May 20th, 1987.
Ladies and gentlemen, at 12:06 a.m., Wednesday, May 20th, Edward Earl Johnson was executed in the lethal gas chamber here at the Mississippi State Penitentiary in conformance with the sentence of the Circuit Court of Leake County.
Needless to say, the documentary was absolutely harrowing and I couldn't get it out of my head for a very long time. Soon I learned that the practice of capital punishment had been done away with in the UK many years prior, and so my interest in the topic kind of waned.
Millions are asking, is it civilized to kill by law? Does it really act as a deterrent? Is it right to ask any human being to carry out the killing? This was the law of the centuries gone by. Should it remain the law of the 20th?
It wasn't until I moved to the US and started working in documentary film that my interest in the topic was piqued again, when I realized that many states across the country have a very active death penalty system. In the past few years, covering death penalty cases, I've come across so many questions of innocence, questions around wrongful convictions, and so many criticisms of the system as a whole. So now that we've cleared up how I came to tell these stories, I'd love to give you a brief historical overview of the death penalty in America and get into some of the critiques around the death penalty as a whole. Unsurprisingly, America adopted its death penalty system from Great Britain, my hometown. And back then, people could be executed for very minor offenses, such as stealing grapes or killing chickens. It was Thomas Jefferson who first proposed a bill to tighten the usage of the death penalty, arguing that it should only be used for murder or treason. His bill was defeated by one vote, but it's as early as this that Americans are arguing against using executions as a punishment for a crime. In fact, Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, put forward one of the oldest criticisms of the death penalty, which was that the death penalty does not serve as a deterrent for crime. Meaning that because the death penalty existed, people weren't any less likely to commit the crimes they were going to commit anyway. To this day, this remains one of the biggest misconceptions about the death penalty as a whole, which is that the existence of this form of punishment acts as a deterrent, i.e. puts people off from committing crimes. When in fact, studies find no meaningful correlation between the existence of the death penalty and a reduction in crime or violent crime.
States that have repealed the death penalty have actually seen a decrease in their homicide rates. And there's absolutely no information to suggest that the death penalty in any way deters violent crime.
Executions during this time were also very public, but then in 1834, Pennsylvania became the first state to move executions out of the public eye and into correctional facilities. Now, of course, there's very strict protocols around who can witness executions. Then in 1846, Michigan became the first state to abolish the death penalty for anything other than treason.
It was quite a contentious thing to do in 1846. The area around Michigan was regarded pretty much as the Wild West.
And soon after that, Rhode Island and Wisconsin abolished the death penalty entirely. While some states were moving away from the death penalty, others were gripping tighter to it and expanding its usage, especially for so-called crimes of enslaved people.
The death penalty is lynching stepchild. We moved lynchings from outside to inside in the 1940s and 50s when the political pressure on these communities that tolerated this spectacle violence got so great that they no longer felt like they could do it with impunity. And so we had these sham trials that didn't last very long, where people were quickly convicted, many of them innocent, wrongly accused.
The racist legacy of the death penalty remains to this day, with it being disproportionately used against black people. Not only is it dished out far more regularly against people of color, you are also 4.3 times more likely in this country to receive the death penalty if your victim is white than if your victim is black. Thus the argument that in this country some lives are valued over others. Fast forward to the 1970s, the Supreme Court actually rules that because the death penalty is arbitrarily imposed, it should be banned because it's not fair.
But in 1972, the Supreme Court's ruling on a case called Furman versus Georgia changed the way states executed prisoners.
In 1972, the Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was cruel and unusual.
So let me explain what it means for the death penalty to be arbitrarily imposed. It basically means that if somebody commits a crime in one state, they could be given a prison sentence, and if that same crime was committed by someone in the next state over, they could be sentenced to death. It sort of makes up a geographical lottery on where you happen to commit a crime. And this is still a major argument against the death penalty. For example, you have the Parkland school shooter who committed one of the deadliest mass murders in US history, and he was sentenced to prison for life.
The court imposes a mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole.
And then you have someone like Nathaniel Woods out of Alabama who never actually killed someone, but was present at a location where someone shot and killed 3 police officers. He's been sentenced to death. Notice the difference in complexions.
Alabama is about to execute 44-year-old Nathaniel Woods for the murders of 3 police officers he did not kill.
Okay, so back in the 1970s, the Supreme Court says that the death penalty as a whole is unfair and it should be banned. But to cut a long story short, the ban lasted around 10 years. And then the states who wanted to keep their death penalty around figured out loopholes and workarounds. And eventually the Supreme Court agrees that the states can go ahead and start executing people again.
Less than 2 years ago, death cells in prisons throughout America were emptied when the Supreme Court ruled against capital punishment. Now, though, the court is having to think again, and while it's doing so, death rows throughout the country are filling up again.
The first execution after the ban happening in January of 1977, there's been thousands of executions since then. Other than the unfairness with regards to who gets the death penalty and who doesn't, the other huge critique of the death penalty is of course the risk of executing innocent people. Since 1973, the Death Penalty Information Center estimates around 200 people have been executed who have later been exonerated for the crime, i.e. they've been proven innocent. In fact, already on my YouTube page, you'll find a couple of cases of people who have very strong innocence claims who may be put to death any day now. That's at least 200 people executed for crimes they never committed. Of course, death is a punishment that cannot be reversed. To be clear, our criminal justice system gets it wrong a lot. Human error and foul play make for a very ineffective system that gets it wrong a ton. In fact, the documentary I brought up at the beginning of this video, 14 Days in May, many people believe that Edward Earl Johnson, the man that was executed, was actually innocent.
Do you have any last statements? Yes, he did. He indicated his innocence and that he regretted the situation, but that he bore no ill will towards anyone. And he was thankful that the process was coming to a close for himself and his family. And stated that he was not guilty.
And I can only say this. When the family asked me why, all I could say was, it's a sick world. It's a sick world.
The warden at the prison where he was executed was so sure that he was innocent that he became a very outspoken critic of the death penalty. He believed without question that Edward was an innocent man. Another argument I hear for the death penalty a lot is the cost. The argument goes somewhat like this: why should we as taxpayers pay for someone's room and board for years and years when we could just kill them instead? And even though I understand the premise of that argument, the US correctional system is hardly the Four Seasons. In fact, studies consistently find that it is far cheaper to keep someone behind bars for the rest of their life than it is to kill them.
Many people think the death penalty costs taxpayers less than serving life in prison.
It's a fallacy that executions are cheaper.
And every study and report we found said the same thing. the death penalty costs more than life in prison.
This is because the state's process of finally executing someone can go on for many, many years, putting a strain on state-appointed attorneys and defense counsel. The courts also have to rehear the case again and again, and the trials go on far longer because, of course, someone's life is on the line.
It found death penalty trials cost almost 50% more than a trial where prosecutors seek life in prison.
Plus, there's also a need for more experts during the trial, and the receipts can just be very long. Most death rows also require solitary confinement in a special housing unit in correctional facilities. And this isn't just inhumane, it's also extremely costly. They require far more security and supervision, more guards to oversee the inmates there, and way more dollars for the state and the taxpayer. And then there's the issue of execution methods. In recent years, there's been a ton of issues with states trying to get access to the lethal injection drugs they need in order to execute someone. This is because pharmaceutical companies often don't want their medicine to be associated with executions. I'll expand on this in another video, but bottom line, the whole process has become far more expensive for states, meaning that it's actually much cheaper to keep someone behind bars for the rest of their life. Now, there's a lot of arguments for the death penalty that we've not covered in this video. Some people quite simply believe in avenging a death. They may bring up the biblical quote, an eye for an eye, forgetting that that quote often goes along with leaves the whole world blind. Whether you believe in the death penalty or not, it's hard to ignore the many critiques that we've discussed. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you agree with the death penalty?
Why are you so against hanging? I'm against it because it's cowardly. I'm against it because it's inefficient. I'm against it because it's evasive, often sadistic, out of date. But above all, I'm against it because I'm trying to be a Christian. It's my job to preach Christianity. I'm perfectly certain that capital punishment is incompatible with the Christian truth and the Christian way.